everyone. Let me just get my microphone here. There are so many things to manage. I'm trying to get it all in place. But hello, it's so nice to be with you all, bringing to you today a quilt trunk show of quilts and their stories. So it's kind of going to be a parade of quilts of different styles and shapes and sizes and all kinds of fun things. And I'll tell you some of the backgrounds behind them. So the first one that I'm going to start with, and let me just get everything set up here and going. So now I'm good. Just trying to manage a number of things here. The first one that I'm going to start with is not actually one that I made, but it's part of my quilting story. This is one that my mom made, and I must have been about 9 or 10 years old when she made this quilt, and it's a Jacob's Ladder pattern. You might recognize it. And it's made with fabrics. Some of them are cottons. A number of them I recognize as scraps left over from her aprons. Some of the fabrics are not cottons. They're mixed, weaves and textiles in them. But I remember making this quilt. And we did, the cutting out of the templates out of cardboard or out of, margarine lids, and then drew out each piece using the templates, cut each individual piece, sewed them all together. And at the time, we were living in a log cabin where we didn't have electricity, and so the whole thing was sewed on a treadle sewing machine. And this quilt is just so nostalgic for me. And this picture, by the way, was taken yesterday. So this is actually the shape that the quilt is in now. I don't use it frequently because some of the fabrics are starting to get very fragile and worn, but it is still in my house and in use. So that's really special to me. And here's a little closer up look. You can see some of the blue is kind of a woven, knobby sort of fabric that's throughout the quilt. And it is, of course, hand quilted. And so as a child, I learned to quilt too, kind of at my mother's knee. And she had the style of quilting frame that was sort of room sized. So it had 4 legs and slats of wood that you spread the whole quilt, stretched the whole quilt out on. It wasn't one of the roller style that's a little more small. No, when we had a quilt set up, it took up the whole living room and everyone either walked around it or if it was a really big quilt, crawled under it. So that's how we would have made this one. And here's a quick look at the backing of the quilt. It was actually a sheet that my mother used for the backing on the quilt. I'm just reading your comments. We're having a connection problem. The video pauses every once in a while. Okay, so I maybe should interject here before we get going too much further. We're going to have a period of time for questions at the end. And what I'll do is after I'm finished showing you all the quilt photos, I'll just turn on a screen with kind of the name of the show and some music playing. And I'll leave that up for 7 or 8 minutes to give you time to get your questions, jotted down and typed into the comments, and then I'll come back on the screen and answer those questions. So there will be plenty of time to get those together at the end of the show. The next project I want to show you is also a very nostalgic one. So what you're seeing here is a McCall's pattern, and it was printed in 1952 or 53, and this is the original pattern. This was in my mom's sewing cabinet all the years that I was growing up, and I remember looking at this pattern thinking, oh gosh, I really want one of those coats, and I never had one. So, I finally had to take it into my own hands and make one. So you're seeing the fabric in the photo too. And what I did, because quilting is what I love, and machine quilting especially, is I took this yardage of fabric and I quilted it, like all the yards. And then I took the coat pattern and cut out the individual pieces. And then I sewed it as though that quilted fabric were the outer cloth for my coat. And then the print that you're seeing the corner of there became the lining. So let me show you what it looked like finished. This is my young friend Addie, who's wearing the coat for us so we can see it. And you can see now that red fabric has all been quilted. And so it's a nice warm, cloth for the outside of a coat. And it turned out really well, I thought. I was quite pleased with it. Here's another look at Addie grinning and showing you a little bit of the lining there inside the coat. And I added a couple of little touches. I had a kind of black velvet that I put, you can see on the collar and the buttons. So here's a couple of the details. The welted pocket. There you can see that's a pocket with the sleeve kind of tucked inside. and a bound buttonhole. And you know, for me, this was kind of a stretch. I had not done very much of this tailored type of sewing. So doing these bound buttonholes and just the extra attention to detail was quite fun. And I covered my own buttons so that they could be the black velvet matching the collar and the pocket as well. So that was a really fun project. And by the way, this coat did go on to win a couple of ribbons at shows because it's not very common to see quilted cloth made into garments. So that was a really fun thing. So here's another interesting one. This quilt was part of a challenge. So I'm a machine quilter and I'm a member of a guild. And so in my local city, there's a group of us that get together and we have different types of machines and do different types of quilting. But every year there's a couple of challenges that people take part in. And it's so fun to see the different results that come when you're given just this little criteria of things to use. So in this case, the challenge was to use fabric selvages. And this was my take on it. Everyone's project was very, very different. They were all original designs. So when I say selvages, this is what I'm talking about. The woven edge of fabric, when you buy it by the yard, that woven edge is called the selvage. And in recent years, pattern and fabric designers have really gone to great lengths to make these selvages be extra charming and useful. And so you're seeing projects cropping up that use them. So take, for example, the one that's at the very top with all the little trees on it. That's kind of a reference for all the different colors that are in that piece of fabric. So if you were wanting to coordinate it, for example, with some greens or some browns or some purples, those are the exact shades that are in the fabric. Lower down in the little dinosaurs, you're seeing the same thing. Every color of dinosaur, that color is also in that piece of fabric. So it makes cool. I've collected. And here's a closer up look. It's that same quilt, but you can see how I've just layered those selvage edges one over another. And they won't ever fray because it's not a raw edge. It's the woven edge of the fabric. But you do see that kind of little edge showing there. It's not enclosed in a seam. And here's one more look at kind of the greens and aquas. Also all little selvages, and you can see some of the titles that are showing there. And then, of course, because quilting is my thing, I had to have fun with that part. So I quilted this design on my long arm quilting machine with different thread colors, and it's literally just doodling, just playing on the surface of the quilt. This is another fun project, also using selvages. Can you see where I've used them in this little project? I call this my Bibliocat quilt because I've got a cat that loves books. And later on in the show, I'll show you another picture of my cat. He is all black, and so he inspired, of course, the kitty that is in this photo. And he's kind of the quality control in my quilting studio. He's always present, always checking things out. But I use the selvages in this case as titles on the books. So you can see some of the fun ones here. Pie Making Day by Brenda Ratliff. Baskets of Scraps by Julie Rothermel. So these are actually just cut off of the selvages of fabric. So the names that you see will be the designer of that fabric. And then, of course, the title that they gave to that specific fabric. I think Katie Jump Rope is one of my favorites. Love those. So I just use them as titles in my books. Here you can see a few more of the books and some of the extra details I put in. A little reading lamp casting a nice soft light on the bookshelf. A few more books, kind of with a leaning one. That's how my bookshelves look. They're always a little bit well-used looking. There's books here and there and stacks and piles and leaning books. That's the way a bookshelf should be, in my opinion. And one last close-up of the little kitty, and I even gave him a ball of yarn. Like it's actual yarn sewn onto the quilt top, and it's got a tail that dangles off the end because he's playing with it. So that's my bookshelf project. This is another fun one that is very dear to my heart. I made this quilt for my husband for his 50th birthday. And he is a musician. He particularly plays guitar, but he plays other things as well. So you see the kind of curved line on the top right-hand side that's quilted in there. That's kind of representing a piano keyboard because he plays that as well. But what makes this quilt particularly special in our family is all the scraps that are in it are these bits and pieces that are just randomly kind of crazy quilted together, but they're memories from our family. So they're left over from the kids' PJs or shorts or little playing outfits. And I collected many of those pieces together and tucked them into this quilt. So there's a few more close-ups of it. Because it's all very scrappy and very kind of improvisationally pieced. In other words, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just all these raw edge scraps. When it came time to, affix the guitar to the quilt, I had this raw edge that I could not easily turn under and stitch down. So I did this really fine bias tape, and that's the edge of the guitar that you're seeing there that stitches down that raw edge. And here's another close-up of kind of the business end of the guitar. This is where the guitar strings are attached to the little tuning posts. And they often look like that on a real guitar. They've got a little kind of pigtail of extra wire there. And so that's what I was showing in this part of the guitar. And then here I quilted a bass clef. So if any of you read music, you'll be familiar with this symbol. It represents a symbol on written sheet music, the bass clef. So I just quilted that in there. And one more detail, a little more close-up of the keyboard area. Can you see how I've got the white and the black keys kind of represented there just in the quilting? It's very stylized, but you get the idea. It's a musical quilt. This one is another similar project to the guitar in that it's got this same kind of positive and negative image, right? So you can see half the apple is green and the other half is the background fabric. Half the background is green and half is the background fabric. And I kind of juxtapose them one against the other. It's this, like it's a positive, negative image, and it was really fun to work with. But in this case, all the greens are likewise scraps out of my scrap bins, but instead of doing kind of a crazy quilt style random piecing, they're just long, slim strips. So I just found all the greens in my scrap bins and cut strips out of them to create the background on the right-hand side and the apple portion on the left. I guess we'll call it a Granny Smith apple. I don't know what other apple is green, but... And I'll show you a few close-ups. This is the green side of the apple, and you can see that I quilted just a leafy kind of texture and design on there. Plus I added a leaf on the top of the apple as well. And all of the stitching on this one was done on my long arm machine. So even the applique stitching that attaches the apple to the quilt, all of that I did on my long arm machine. So that was kind of a fun experiment. I hadn't done that before. And here's a look at the other side of the apple. On this side, you're getting a glimpse of the seeds and just the little texture that I added that I thought kind of looked like the inside of an apple. And then a close-up of a bit of the quilting. And I just quilted a different fun, slim design in each of those stripes. But of course, I had to put an apple a day in my quilt as well. And then I hid one more little surprise in there. Can you see the little worm? And I have to ask you, what is worse than finding a worm in your apple? And of course, the answer is finding half a worm. And then one more little detail. This is kind of the background of that same apple quilt. And I just took a quilt patchwork design and tried to recreate that with my quilting to show off where those squares would be just by alternating the flat quilted places and the puffy unquilted places. So I was happy with how that turned out. This is another quilt that's dear to my heart. Can you tell I have quite a lot of those? I really do. And this is a pretty recent finish for me. This is not my own design. This was a pattern that I purchased, but it has two major parts to it. One is all the blocks that are hand embroidered. And then, of course, the secondary part is the piecing of the stars and the little Dresden plates around the outside edge. So now you've had a look at the thing as a whole. I'll show you some of the close-up pictures. Here are a couple of the dresses that I was embroidering. And the lady who designs these embroidery patterns is just a wonderful artist. Like, isn't that the most charming of little dresses? And it's pretty simple. The little French knots look like little polka dots and ribbons. It's just so, so pretty. And here's another with some beautiful flowers, curlicues on it. And I do enjoy hand embroidery. So this quilt took me quite a long time to make, a number of months. but I just enjoyed this type of embroidery sitting in the evenings and that type of things. I would just sit and do this handwork, and I really enjoy that. And the center part of the quilt has this sort of focus block. There's a few dresses hanging out on the wash line. And then, of course, the most important thing in a dress is the woman wearing it. Isn't that the truth? And then here's a close-up of those flowers that were along the outer edge of that square. And I just put this close-up in so that you could kind of appreciate embroidery. In some ways is kind of an old-fashioned craft and kind of went out of style, it seems like, for some years, but it's really gaining in popularity again, and I'm so happy to see it being used again. So the lady that designs this pattern designs a lot of quilt patterns, and all of them feature hand embroidery, and she's very gifted at creating these beautiful flowers and teaching people how to do this kind of stitchery, and it's so pretty. And now we'll look at some of the same things with the quilting added, because of course that's my particular joy, is to quilt things. So I've made the words look like kind of a ribbon banner in this example, and I've put some focus kind of fluffy flowers on the outer perimeter and then just filled it in with some fun texture. And here's a close-up look at one of the little Dresden plates. So these little Dresdens are 6 inches across from tip to tip. They are tiny, tiny. Each little blade is just tiny. So the fabric that you're seeing in the wide green stripe kind of on the left, that is the only fabric I purchased for this quilt. And I did that because it had all the colors that were in those sweet little dresses, the pinks and the corals and the yellows and the greens. And then, because these Dresden plates were so tiny, I just went rummaging in my scrap baskets, and all the colors that were similar I pulled out and represented in those little Dresden plates, and the stars as well. And then this is a picture of the edging of the quilt. At my last trunk show, a couple of people asked how I finish my quilts. And I know a lot of people are maybe more dedicated than me and do a hand-stitched binding, but for myself, I'm usually wanting to get on to the next quilt by this time, so I do my bindings all on my sewing machine. So I stitch them on the back of the quilt, and then I wrap them around to the front and top stitch them down, and this is what they look like when they're finished. On to another quilt. This too has some special memories. This is a quilt my sister pieced, I'm going to say in the very early 1990s. So, you know, back when the rose and the cream fabrics were pretty popular and kind of calico prints, and that's what she used for this quilt. And so when she brought it to me about a year ago to quilt it, we were like, what could we quilt on it that would carry out that theme? And of course we thought, we have to quilt wild roses. So this was my idea, was to quilt these kind of wreaths within the Irish chain blocks that are, it's got a wild rose on one side and then just kind of leafy and little buds around it that just carries on that rosy sort of theme. This is yet another fun one. Some of you may recognize this. It's commonly called a Cathedral Window quilt. But by definition, it's not really a quilt because it has no batting in it, and the layers aren't quilted together. So it's really a coverlet. But that doesn't sound as good, does it? Anyway, Cathedral Window, and you can see why. It's got all these beautiful samplers of colors that are tucked in these windows. And this quilt too, I made over a period of years. And in fact, some of the fabrics came from my relatives all across Canada and the United States. So it represents the scraps from a lot of quilt makers. But the story behind this quilt is when I was growing up, we had a family friend who made a number of these, and she did them 100% by hand. And I was so fascinated by the way that these coverlets were put together. When I was in my 20s, I would say, I had young children. I asked her if she would teach me how to do it. And so she finally did. And so then I gave myself 10 years to make this quilt, and I think I probably used all of them. And of course, I didn't sew on it the whole time. I would work on it for a couple of months and then pack it away again until the next year and that sort of thing. But here's a closer up look at all the different fabrics that are in it and kind of how it's constructed. So quilters call this a charm quilt when every single square is different from the others. So I just left for kind of a conversation starter within the quilt, I left 2 squares that repeat. So there's a green one and there's a kind of fall colored one, of which there are 2. And I know where they are. And so whenever I show this quilt at a quilt show, that's kind of the question is, can you find the repeating pieces? Because there are only 2 of them. Here's a close-up look at what it looks like when you're putting it together. So you kind of start, the muslin, the creamy background is a 9-inch square for each of these blocks when you start. And the way you fold it and turn it, you end up with bias edges that you can turn for these curves. So it's really easy to make a graceful and smooth curve. And then that curve is all stitched down by hand. So you can see where I'm working there. I've got them pinned in place and I've got my needle and thread ready to keep on stitching. And here's a look at one of them that's finished up. And you can see how there's layers and layers of fabric, so it's warm as a coverlet should be, but there's actually no batting or quilting in it. Once they're sewn together and those little curved edges are sewn down, that's it. It's finished. And here is something that I am working on currently. So this is a term, it's not a new technique. I think it has been used for a long period of time, but more in England than in North America. But it's called English paper piecing. So when you look at this piece, it's kind of puzzling how that's put together, right? The trick is it's not put together at the sewing machine. It does not have long, straight seams in it anywhere. So I'll show you behind the scenes. Here's the back of that same piece. So this is where the paper comes into the paper piecing. There's a paper shape for each one of those pieces, and you baste the fabric around that piece, and then you hand whip stitch those pieces together. So the beauty of it is you can do this quite intricate piecing with shapes that have different points and angles that you could not do at a sewing machine, but you can do them by hand with this English paper piecing method. So I've given myself 10 years for this one too. So we'll try and have another trunk show in 10 years and I'll try and show you it finished. Currently I have, I think, 10 of those flowers done. So yeah, I have a long ways to go because after the flowers are done, then there's all the connecting pieces. And that's how that will all come together. But it will in fact be a quilt and I will quilt it. And I'll use it. None of my quilts are too fancy for using. So that's that one. Here's another unique one. And you're getting to see this one. It was actually hanging at a quilt show, and you can see I did win a ribbon for it, so that was kind of fun. This quilt is not patchwork, obviously. It's just a whole cloth quilt. It's made from one single piece of fabric. And this was just kind of a personal challenge because machine quilting is what I loved. I wanted to challenge myself to do something that was intricate and something that was a picture, not just a like a grid or a loops, things like that. I just wanted to do something pictorial. So this was my challenge to myself. You can get a good look at it here as a whole. You can see there are 8 different owls, all kind of facing toward the outside edge. And then let's have a look at some of them close up. So this was really fun to practice giving these owls expressions. And I mean, some of them like this one look a bit startled, don't they? Big eyes, but owls also have big eyes. And you can see each owl is sitting on a kind of branch. And there was just a circular branch that goes around the quilt. And that's how I sort of tied it together as I sat each of the owls on this branch. And in terms of how I quilted it, I did sketch them in place first with like an erasable fabric marker so that they had kind of an outline and a shape. And then I just doodled these little owls. Here's a couple more. Now this guy, I'm thinking he was a night owl and I'm thinking he had way too many midnight snacks. What do you think? He's a pretty chubby owl and kind of half asleep too, but also sitting on that same branch. And each owl is about 8 to 12 inches tall. They vary just a little bit. Here's another kind of chubby one. And he has some interesting feathers, and look at his eyebrows. Don't they look rough? But it was really fun to dream up these different owls and see how many textures I could use to create, expression on their faces. And here's kind of a tall, slim owl with a gorgeous tail hanging off his perch. And one last look. Same owl quilt, and this is my cat. He's doing the quality control here, keeping an eye on things, making sure all the details are done. So that's what he was doing. So that's the end of my photographs. So we're going to go into a solid screen again for a few minutes, and I'll give you guys 5 or 6 minutes to think of questions and type them into the chat window. At the end of about 5 minutes, I'll come back on, and some questions arose at the last trunk show I did, so I'll start talking about those, and you'll still have a little more time then to type in any questions that you may have today, and I will take the time to answer any question that you've got, so bring them on. Well, hello, I'm back again. So there's still time to keep writing your questions. A few of them have come in already. I realized in thinking back through my presentation that I really didn't introduce myself very well, so I thought I might take a moment to do that and tell you a little bit of my quilting story. Again, while you're pulling some questions together. So I did, as I mentioned, grow up sewing and quilting kind of alongside my mom throughout my childhood years. But mom was a very traditional quilter, and so rotary cutters were not common back then, so we cut each piece individually, sewed them, some years on a treadle sewing machine, some years on an electric one. And then, of course, we did hand quilting. So I learned how to do all of that. And throughout my 20s and even 30s, I made the very occasional quilt, but I didn't know very many other quilters, like for the hand quilting portion, and so it seemed to take so long to make one quilt by myself. So when our kids were kind of in high school and or leaving home, I began to explore the idea of learning machine quilting, which is a completely different technique from hand quilting and a different art form in a way. So this was about 7 or 8 years ago that I began machine quilting, and I very much fell in love with it. I mean, look how many quilts I'm able to make, right? Because I can speed up the quilting process, and I just found that I really, really enjoy doing the machine quilting. So now I make all the quilts that I showed today in the pictures are my own, but what I do for kind of my day job is I quilt for people. So they will bring to me their pieced pretty quilt top, whatever it may be, and I'll put the layers together with the batting and with the backing that they provide, and I'll do the quilting on it for them, and then they take their quilt home and finish it. So that's kind of my day job. So I spend a lot of time at my machine quilting. To date, I've done about 850 quilts in the last 7 years. So that keeps me really, really busy. So that's a little bit of my story. But I will always love making quilts, so I always find time to make my own. So let's look over some of the questions. Do you let other people use the patterns that you've created? One person asks. The short answer is yes. I've actually published a number of patterns, both like printed them up myself and made them available for sale, and also had them published in magazines. So that's one way. Some of the quilts that I've made, for example, the owls that I showed you, or the guitar, or the apple, it's just a thing I did one time, and I have not written out instructions or created a pattern. So people could certainly use the idea, but I don't have a pattern to show them how to do it. Michelle asks, do you do much free motion quilting for smaller projects on your sit-down machine? Not very often. I have done in the past. Now I find it faster, quite honestly, just to get it loaded on my long arm machine and quilt there. Again, they're two fairly different skills, and so to keep kind of sharp and well practiced at one of them kind of means you let the other one go. Someone asks, all the details, is it all quilted in the designs? Now, I'm guessing you're talking about maybe the owl details or the guitar quilt details, and the answer is yes, they are all quilted. And it is not done with there's no computer driving the machine. I literally have handles that I hold on to, and I literally am doodling those designs. In some cases, I do use a ruler to help create some of the straight lines, but it's all hand-guided, we call it. And for the embroidery, what kind of thread do you use? It looks very shiny. I used a brand of thread called Cosmo, and it's fairly typical 6-strand embroidery floss. And I think everything in that quilt was done with 2 strands. So it's nothing fancy, and there was only about 10 colors of thread in that whole quilt. But the designer did a great job choosing beautiful colors for it. Favorite quilt, the owls and the bookcase. I'm happy to hear that. The bookcase quilt is one that I have created a pattern from. And it's one that I've made a number of times, and each one is a little bit different. And so when I created the pattern, I offered options to people. So, for example, you can include the black cat or not, the lamp or not. You can put a pretty vase in it. You can have a family photograph, and you can print on fabric pretty easily. You could put a photograph on the bookshelf. In a couple of mine, I've taken what I call an orphan quilt block. So just a leftover small block left over from some other quilt. And I've put that in the back of the bookshelf so it looks kind of like a picture hanging on the wall. So there's any number of ways you can personalize it. You can add more shelves. You can add, more or fewer books. You can make your stacks as messy or as neat as you want to. So that's a kind of fun one to experiment with and personalize. Sally asks, how long did it take you to stitch the owl quilt? She's got a couple questions. We'll go one at a time. How long did it take me? Sally, I don't think that I can give you a very good answer. I would say at least 30 or 35 hours to stitch that quilt. It was not quick. But, I wasn't in it for being quick. I was in it for art, for playing, for creating something beautiful. And you ask if I've ever seen the movie Rock-a-Doodle. The owls look like the ones in that movie. And sorry, no, I have not ever seen that movie. So, Michelle, I enjoyed each and every quilt you've shared with us. Thank you. You are so welcome. So I'll chat just a minute more. If you have any last question you want to get in, now is the opportunity. But I really hope that you've enjoyed seeing this little parade of some of the quilts that I have made. The one behind me that you're seeing me sit in front of is another one that I've made. This is not my own design, but I did make this quilt. So someone else made the pattern and gave me the ideas. But it's a really fun one, too, with these lovely floral blossoms. So I do love making quilts. I just remembered, too, I do have a few questions in front of me on a piece of paper that came in at the last trunk show. And I thought some of you might enjoy hearing about those. So let's go over a couple of them. My last trunk show, which is available for going back and watching if you haven't had a chance to see it, I was presenting vintage quilts that are made from 50 or 75-year-old quilt tops or fabric pieces. And so one of the questions was what I use to clean the quilts. And when I'm working with really fragile textiles like that, there's a product called Retro Wash, which is made specifically for vintage textiles. It's really gentle and very soft on the fabric. So that's what I use to clean those special quilts. And someone asked if I have created any of my own quilts. And you kind of got the answer today. The guitar, the apple, the owls, the library quilt, those were all my own designs and creations. What are the materials you use? In general, I use quilting cottons, like 100% cotton fabrics, but that is not always true. My mom used to put whatever kind of fabric she had into her quilts, and I've done that too. I've put denim in a quilt, corduroy in a quilt, lace in a quilt. I find that it doesn't really matter. It just adds to the texture and beauty of the quilt. So use what you have. And someone asked, how long does one quilt take? That's not an easy thing to answer because, of course, some of them are different sizes and different, levels of detail and complexity. So, it might take as little as 12 or 15 hours to create a quilt. In the case of the Cathedral Window, it probably has 500 or 600 hours in it. But, that's just the type of thing that I work on either while I'm traveling or while I'm sitting in the evening with the family. And so I don't really count the hours. I just know at the end of those years, I've got something to show for my leisure time. So I love to spend my time doing handwork like that. So thank you all ever so much for joining me. It has been a pleasure. I think that's all the questions that I have. So thanks again. You have a wonderful rest of your day.